This week on Inside Olympia.
The legislature stands adjourned. Session is adjourned, citing that.
It's a wrap on Washington's 2026 legislative session. And while it was a short session, it was also a historic one, with passage of the state's first income tax. This hour, we take stock of the last 60 days and the big decisions with our reporters panel, Shauna Sowersby of the Seattle Times and Jerry Cornfield of the Washington State Standard.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Washington's 60-day 2026 legislative session is one for the history books. The conventional wisdom used to be that you don't raise taxes in an election year. But this year, majority Democrats did more than raise taxes. They voted to enact the state's first income tax aimed at people making more than $1 million. Now the question is, will it cost them in the fall elections? And will the tax survive an inevitable court challenge and potential repeal effort at the ballot? The income tax was just the most high-profile issue of an action-packed 60-day session. Joining me now, and for the full hour this week to break down the session, are two members of the Capitol Press Corps. Shauna Sowersby is state politics reporter with the Seattle Times, and Jerry Cornfield is senior reporter with the Washington State Standard. Great to see you both. Thanks for coming and do this. Often we have you on for half the program. We have you on for the full hour because they packed so much into 60 days, we need the full hour. So thanks for being here. Let's just start with some sort of big picture takeaways. I'm very interested, and I'll start with you, Jerry, in this idea that it feels like the income tax, for as long as we've been covering the state legislature, has been sort of the third rail of Washington politics. It's also, to some extent, been the holy grail of many Democrats. And it seems like the holy grail part sort of rose up and took precedence this year, and did the third rail just disappear? What's your analysis of sort of what's going on?
It's pretty amazing, right? I mean, it just went from last spring, summer, talk about, and now it's going to be signed in a couple of weeks. And not long ago, you and I would probably, and they would have lawmakers would introduce the tax, and we'd say, there it is, maybe they'll give it a hearing, but usually it was just introduction of an income tax. So,
not to mention that the legislature passed a ban on the income tax a couple of years ago.
right, that's, and they did it by wide margins, right? The voters signed the initiative, and then they did it by wide margin. But it surprised me at how quickly it went. And then this governor, who last year, it was a guess on what he would do on all the taxes until the very last day when he signed them, going from there to getting out in front of it first. I mean, literally the first elected official in the legislature and executive branch to say, I want an income tax. So it's something that's changed out there. They'll tell you it's polling. They'll tell you it's the mood. They'll tell you it's a lot of things. But they felt like now is the time, so they did it.
Well, the other thing, Shauna, is that there was, I think going into the session, a lot of anticipation about would they, go for a wealth tax? Would they go for this payroll tax, Seattle-style payroll tax? And then suddenly the income tax, the so-called millionaire's tax, becomes the thing. And for as significant and historic as the vote is, and the fact we're at this moment, this is far from a fait accompli, right? There's still the potential for repeal at the ballot, maybe a high potentiality for that. And on the one hand, I think Jamie Peterson, the Senate Majority Leader, wants to get this before the Supreme Court, but it's going to be a very different makeup of the kind of court that then decided the capital gains tax a couple of years ago that will now be looking at whether this is constitutional. So it's not a guarantee.
Correct. Yeah, it's not a done deal yet. I think that they're not even planning on including this until further up the road.
It is in the budget, but out years.
Correct. Yeah. And so it does remain to be seen whether or not it does have that referendum proof clause added to it. So there can't be a referendum on it. It's got a higher bar to clear with, if somebody decides to file an initiative on it. And then still there is, what is obviously going to be some sort of court challenge down the road for that.
Did it seem like, it seemed as if a couple of weeks ago things were maybe starting to get a little rocky with whether this could actually make it through. What was there a moment where you were thinking, maybe Democrats were a little too ambitious for a 60-day session?
Yeah, I definitely thought that. When Ferguson came out and said, this doesn't go far enough for the third time, that he wanted to see more in it, I thought for sure, with only a couple of weeks remaining in session, that it was not going to make it with what he came out and said until that, the amendment by Rep. April Berg got added to it, and then it seemed like he was pretty happy with that change.
I think, though, the Senate moved very quickly on it, right? They moved in, and the Senate had an approach. They wanted to get it done because I think everyone knew the big changes were going to come in the House. The caucus is so big, 59 members. They've got the progressives. They want this. But there were pieces in the original bill that it would, they were shaking their heads. There's just no way. I mean, they wanted to roll back taxes, including on major corporations that they had just approved several months ago, saying, here's a surcharge on some of these massive corporations. For 4 years, we're only going to do it for 3, and it made no sense to cut them a break, but they wanted the House to take it off. So I think there was, it was in doubt, but I don't think it was seriously in doubt. There were people who had a lot of questions. The other part is and they won't have time to fix it probably next session, but there were so many changes going down the stretch. They rolled back taxes that they passed last year. They had members in that caucus saying, we want more detail because you told us things were going to happen last session. They didn't happen the way you told us. So I think there was a trust factor within that caucus, too, of what is actually in this bill versus the idea of an income tax. So.
What do you make of a 24-and-a-half-hour debate, which I guess maybe wasn't the longest ever, but certainly the longest
someone found it?
I don't
Yeah.
know.
When did
I don't know. Everybody's been
That's
saying
news
one
to
of the
me.
longest. I mean, can't you just say the longest? I mean, it seems like the longest in the 20-plus years I've been paying attention to this place. But nonetheless, what was that like? I mean, obviously the Republicans were introducing a lot of amendments and trying to kind of run out the clock there. But I mean, we should just pause and sort of acknowledge that was an extraordinary 24 hours.
It was extraordinary. A lot of other bills died along the way. It put some bills in jeopardy right up to the very end of the session because you just can't give. There was a lot of floor time that the House spent. I think some folks thought we could have started at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. and gone and
Instead
maybe
of 5
it
or
wouldn't-
5:30.
Yeah, and it might not have gone 24 hours. I mean, there's something, though, at some point. It's kind of like going in college, I can do an all-nighter, and when you get to that 3 or 4 a.m., you go, I can do it. And I think there was a bit of that. We want to get to 24 hours. We're not going to quit at 10 or 12. We're going for it. And there was a little of that going on. But there were a lot of ideas out there that I've heard from Republicans and Democrats in the amendments. But when you bring them up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., the impact isn't there. So I'm not sure if they accomplished a lot of talking. I think some of their better ideas probably didn't get as much sunlight as they wanted.
Well, I think, too, you were talking about this being an election year. I think this goes well for both parties, right? Because the Republicans get to say, well, we introduced all these amendments and we really fought for it and, we took it to the end. And the Democrats can say the same thing. We fought off all these amendments. So, I think it bodes well for both of their constituents that they're able to kind of have something that they rallied against for so long.
What do you think about Republicans, I think it was the Senate Republicans, just put on, social media, worst session ever or something. I mean, this is a seismic moment in terms of Washington state tax policy and kind of the direction of the state. And again, as I said, the income tax has been the third rail. You could look at this as a defeat for Republicans and as sort of further evidence of their eroded numbers in the legislature. On the other hand, potentially, Democrats have just given them a great campaign issue. How are you thinking about this, Jerry?
I mean, it could be a golden moment for them in some of the elections this year. It's an issue to talk about. Sadly, for the Republican Party in Washington and a lot around the country, the federal government, the president now, continues to just be a weight on the party. So the moderate Republicans in suburban districts, they could talk all they want about some of these policies, but they have a hard time breaking free of the president, who so many independent voters in this state just can't find a way to support a member of his party.
Do you think that's why Democrats pounced now? Because they knew that even if this costs them, it's not going to cost them that greatly because of the Trump factor?
I mean, I don't know, because I'm not in that camp that says we're going to see it on the ballot this year. I mean, I just can't see why.
But they'll be on the ballot.
It'll be on the ballot, but if it's
But
on the
Democrats will be on the ballot.
Yeah, this year. Next year they aren't.
Right.
I mean, if they
But-
get an initiative to the legislature, 2027, there's no President Trump on the ballot. It's a smaller turnout, more conservative electorate, more focus, if it gets to that point. But yeah, I don't know.
Let's transition to a couple other tax things they did. They rolled back the estate tax increase that they did last year, which put us as an outlier state. Made a couple of other changes. Just any thoughts on the significance of that, or sort of how that gets paired with the millionaire's tax?
I mean, I think it's kind of a silent omission that maybe they screwed up on some of those taxes by enacting
Little
those
overreach,
last year.
maybe,
Yeah, so I think the income tax kind of overshadows that, so they can quietly kind of go back and change these things and say, maybe we were wrong on these things.
You have to think that the estate tax aside, the governor did say in that one press conference, he kind of alluded that sometimes they overstretch. But if the income tax doesn't stay on the books, these actions, these repeals of the business taxes from last year, that doesn't happen. So they're all tied together. And so we may not know if this is what they did last year will be undone come 2028, 2029, or if it will with the income tax. And one thing that will not change over the next 3 years is costs are going to rise. And while the Democrats have been saying this is the affordability, this is what we did for affordability. Well, in 2029 is when that becomes, but for 2026 and 2027 and 2028, there's nothing in there of substance to sort of redo the tax system. They say is upside down.
What does this say about the governor? And if you think about this session for him, which is his second since being governor, as opposed to last year, and you look at it through the prism of this fight over the tax, he wanted, you noted the changes he insisted upon, forced the House to kind of rewrite the bill. He got the expansion of the working families tax credit, some relief for small businesses. Republicans, of course, are going to say, look, most of this money is going to the general fund to be used as the majority party wishes. But how should we evaluate Ferguson's session, would you say? Did he find his stride this year? Is this a big win for him? Did it feel more like a normal relationship between the governor and legislators as opposed to last year?
That's a good question.
I think they were big training wheels in year one. I think their smaller training wheels are just about ready. By year three, they'll probably be off completely. He clearly showed a better understanding of the legislating process. His team was very adept at getting his agenda moved along. I think lawmakers, all their interactions seem to be more improved on the Democrat side. At this point, this governor has signed when he signs the income tax, sign more and larger tax increases than any governor in the history of the state of Washington. If he decides to run for a second term, he will have to defend. He'll be running as the tax and spend governor. He's on a path to have 4 years of large tax increases, because even with all this stuff, their own budget shows that they start out in the red, and then in 2 fiscal years from now. So there's nothing being done to show that the state's on a pathway to sustainability, even with all the taxes he's signing. But as a governor, he's really improved as an executive. I think he's really improved on how he operates and manages and makes his way through the process.
Well, and it's, the thing that I found kind of striking too was that when the income tax finally passed, he was in the wings. They felt like it. And so, just to see him standing there going into the caucus room with the House Democrats to kind of give them a little speech after everything passed, that was very striking compared to the relationship he seemed to have with them last year.
And soon he'll have press conferences on a regular basis. He had a closing night press conference this year, but he didn't quite join the Democrat leaders down the hall. So we got to have 2 press conferences back to back after Siney died.
Not a joint effort, huh?
No.
This is probably a good moment to transition to the supplemental budget, which also stands out as not your typical kind of ho-hum supplemental budget. This was, once again, they were trying to close a gap between anticipated revenues and anticipated spending. This budget spends more. It's now over $80 billion. The Republicans say it's 11% growth in the budget. That's the calculation that they've come up with. And they're saying that's while the economy is flat. Republicans have criticized this budget as a ticking fiscal time bomb. I didn't get the sense that Democrats felt great about it. There are cuts to K-12 education and higher ed. K-12, of course, is the paramount duty of the state. It's pulling money from state or from police and fire pensions. It's relying on this income tax revenue in the out years, even though, as we've just discussed, who knows if it can survive. It taps into the rainy day fund. It slows that transition to kindergarten program. So what was your sense of where they landed and how Democrats are feeling about what they did? Is this a budget where you pass it and get out of town?
I mean, the reality is the conference budget, each budget, it was larger than either the House or Senate, right? I mean, they ended up finding a middle ground that was higher than either one of them started in some cases.
So rather than meeting kind of in the middle, it just went up.
On the spend, on the cut side, they did try, because the revenue forecast, the most recent one was a good one, they were able to, as they said, the Senate cut deeper in some areas and the House, where they tried to take the less severe cut where there were cuts. I'm sure most of the public would wonder, why are we even cutting monies ahead? They actually have more money after this last revenue forecast than they did when they were adopted the budget. It's after a while it gets tough to track. And when they say $1 billion increase in maintenance level, what it takes just to keep going, and you start to wonder, how is that possible 6 months after they started, that everything had soared so high? So I think there's a lot of question about where the spending is and where the cuts are. But as you know, 2-year budget, they'll get through June 30th, 2027, and they'll still have money in the bank. So things work. But they did do a lot of gimmicks, let's just be honest.
Yeah.
You just listed them, but pension fund, rainy day fund, public works account.
Do you think the pension fund one is something that could be challenged in court? Has anybody talked about that?
Yeah, it seems like there's some groups that are pretty hungry to go, to take it into court on this issue. I can't think of the group off the top of my head, but there's already one group that represents law enforcement and firefighters who are all, like they mentioned, in their 70s and 90s. These are older folks, and so it sounds like they are ready to take this to a lawsuit. The thing I found pretty interesting, too, is when Manuel and I were writing about this, back in, I think, 2001, they tried this as well, and this was one of the things that they had to kind of shore up the budget. But back then, they actually gave stuff back to the pensioners. They would have given them a $10,000 lump sum on top of the money that they get every month. And then it also would have given money to cities and counties to help pay for their medical expenses. And none of that was included in this. This is all just taking it to put into the budget.
But it is at the end of the 4-year cycle. So this is one of these June 30th, last day of the next budget cycle, they'll cut a check. So they have time between now and then to deal with some of the issues, iron out wrinkles, maybe not even do it at all, because it's intended to backfill the rainy day fund. So I think everyone's hoping the economy and the income tax will generate a lot more revenue, and they won't need to make that move. They'll have time to change that.
One of the things that you mentioned is just this sort of reconciling the spending versus the revenues that are needed. And one of the big budget drivers right now are these tort payouts, which are rising exponentially. There was a bill to try to address this, which kind of the wheels fell off the proverbial wagon there in the end. What is your sense of, is that a case of we'll just maybe take a look at that in the next session? What happens with this big budget driver that is costing them money? I got the sense that Democrats and Republicans both don't like having to dedicate that much money to lawsuit payouts. They think that it's not the right direction to be going, and yet there doesn't seem to be a solution.
I mean, yeah, $1 billion is not nothing. And I mean, it feels like last year it wasn't addressed as much as it should have been. And so, they can't keep kicking the can down the road on this thing. They realize they have to address it at some point, and, maybe this was the year to do it. But, I don't foresee this being anything that comes to an end soon. Costs are going to keep rising for those sorts of things. Lawsuits are going to keep coming out. So,
I mean, it does feel like there's three branches, right? You have the legislative, and they're trying to come up with a policy, but they came up with the money side. So we're going to pay because we owe the money.
Yeah.
And then you have the legislative and executive got to work together on the policy. But in the end, these are claims that are going to end up in court. They can't control juries and judges, and they can't control if someone does something wrong and the state's involved and the court can prove it, they are going to pay what they're going to pay, and almost, they'll be very difficult. They're trying to deal with those really old cases through mediation and other methods. I'm not sure there's a policy out there that can, buffer them or insulate them from large payments forever going forward.
I know Democrats, as much as possible, wanted to protect the social safety net, and their base constituents were very concerned about that. What is your sense in the end? I know, again, we talked about K-12 and higher ed getting dinged, and now K-12 apparently will be 42% of the budget. The Republicans say that's lower than at the time of the 2012 McCleary ruling. They did, by the way, on K-12 preserve maintenance, supplies, operations, transportation, MSOC, and increase spending on, and they also maintain the increased spending on special ed. But on the human services, safety net side of things, what is your sense of the extent to which Democrats were able to hold the line, protect that? Medicaid, of course, has been, because of the H.R. 1, was an area of concern. What's your sense there?
well, they did include a little bit more funding for it to kind of shore themselves up against the H.R. 1
changes and some of the costs that are associated with that. Yeah.
But I don't know, Jerry might.
I think they put the money they need to comply with H.R. 1, or they think they need to get all the staffing, and so they won't avoid higher costs. There's a real risk here. If they don't get some of their error rates down in some of these programs, they will get less federal dollars. I mean, with Medicaid, it's a state match to get federal dollars, so they need to work. But I think overall, they did improve. They're going to cover more of the non-citizen who were about to get cut off from Medicaid. They're going to cut there. They're going to be able to do the food assistance. So some of those human services, the day-to-day needs, they, I think, did well with the budget. It's on the other ones. I think education, like you mentioned, is one of those areas they should have probably done better. But I think they made the decision that that we want to save the lives that are on the street or going to get cut off completely, and it hurts them. They want to do both.
I should note that the governor wanted more than $200 million for housing. He got that. He wanted free school breakfast and lunch. That's part of the
Be careful now.
tax.
That's what I've been calling ghost money. It's not until 2029.
And it could go away, right? I mean, the
It doesn't-
budget is balanced, assuming
Or if there's
this-
no income tax, right?
Assuming that money comes
Yeah.
in. But the way they wrote it is if that money comes in, they'll fund the free school breakfast and lunch, which has also been a priority of the governor's. Let's talk about sort of winners and losers. You've been thinking about this, I know, Jerry. The public sector unions were really behind the tax, obviously wanted to protect the base budget. Are they the winners?
I mean, if you listen to the folks in the hallways, this income tax, there was just enough left over to pay for the next collective bargaining agreement. And this was seen as that's why the labor unions were very active, because it does take $2 to $3 billion a biennium for and they're going to have another contract come up. So there's that theory that they're going to get all the general fund dollars essentially after you've done the working family tax credit. So they're obviously a big winner. There's individual winners, who carried the ball on the income tax and the policies. I think one of the big losers and stories we'll be writing in the coming months, and Shauna has written on it too, is the public defense. I mean, the idea that this legislature couldn't decide to tax millionaires to cover the cost of lawyers for those who cannot afford
For indigent
lawyers.
defense.
It started in there and it ends up at zero, and they couldn't add a single dollar. That is, in my mind, a McCleary for criminal justice system kind of decision that might be looming. And then it'll hit the state really hard if it goes that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was a big, I mean, that was one of the things that they had a big chunk of the income tax set aside for that in the original budgets, and then to come away with nothing at the end and just say, yeah, we're going to help out cities and counties with, this certain dollar amount. And cities and counties are saying, well, that's not even enough to cover everything else, let alone public defense services. So, yeah, I'd say they probably lost out the most on
And back to the income tax, some of the last minute negotiating that was going on and talking about the amendment, they had to add language into the intent section. The intent section became the handshake agreement for everybody, because they added the language for the free school lunches, they added the language for local government, they added like 3 words to increase funding for basic education, because at that point it was going to maintain and preserve. And WEA, the teachers union, and the education activists were saying, if you maintain and preserve after an income tax and you've just cut us, you're going to preserve us at a lower level. So there was a lot of arguing over the language and the intent language at the end of the session, just so everyone can signal this is where our future dollars are going to go. And I think so that's going to be an interesting fight in the coming years.
Before we get a break, I do want to ask, there are 3 budgets, the operating budget, transportation, and capital. Something else the governor wanted was money for maintenance and preservation of roads. He got $1.5 billion. I believe it's borrowed money. It's not cash. But, we've got bridges that are on the verge of collapse, in some cases closed and not open to traffic. Again, big priority for the governor. He got it.
He wanted a 10-year plan. This is a 6-year plan. There'll be some bonds. They won't say it directly, but they're bonding the gas tax from last year, part of it, and the fees that came up. So he did, the money's there. We'll see how it gets used in the rest of this budget cycle. Folks have to remember the move ahead package, they called it a couple years ago. They raised fees, they didn't raise the gas tax, and they didn't bond anything. So they've been trying to do a pay as you go, but inflation is just skyrocketing, and the cost of projects are going up. So now they need to go back to the bonding of gas tax and fees, so they know they'll have a stream of revenue to pay for these projects.
Okay. Let's just take a quick break. When we return, we continue our debrief on the legislative session with our reporters panel. Back after this.
There's been losses every year since the early 1920s. The shoreline itself was almost 2 miles further out there. Year after year, more homes would fall in the water. We have nothing to lose.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Jerry Cornfield of the Washington State Standard and Shauna Sowersby of the Seattle Times. Sticking with the transportation theme for a moment, there has been this recurring proposal to reduce the drunk driving limit to 0.05 from 0.08. This is Senator John Lovick's kind of passion bill right now. He's a former state trooper, former sheriff. He was pretty confident after, he's been perennially confident, but did it get any closer this year? Should we be betting on this being a bill that passes into law at some point, or is this just Senator Lovick hitting his head against the wall trying to get this done?
That's a good question. I mean, this is what,
three years,
4
I think?
years?
Yeah,
so
it's
been a while that he's been going for this. I don't know at what point he's just going to give up on that one, or, if he's really that intent about, getting this through. But
I suspect they're going to have to change. Well, we will see a change in the makeup of the committee, the House Community Safety Committee, where
this thing goes to die, yeah.
And then if it gets to the House Transportation Committee, there's not favor. They did have a House version that got out of the House Community Safety, and the Republican on the committee voted for it and offset the Democrats who did not. But the vote changed when the Senate version came over there. There is an issue within the Democratic caucus that believes doing this will lead to more criminalization in some communities. And until the caucus decides it's something they want to do and that they see as improving safety on the highways and not targeting or giving cops chances to target drivers in certain communities, it's probably going to keep fading in the House.
It seems like this was a year, besides the income tax, besides the budget, which obviously took a lot of oxygen, that this was a year also where there was a lot of ripped from the headlines kind of legislation and legislation introduced by Democrats in response to Trump administration policies or sort of what's happening in the country right now. Great example would be, or a prime example would be the ICE enforcement and immigration enforcement. And so, for instance, the bill to ban masked officers. What was your, I mean, that seemed like that just went through so quickly because it was, and the governor wanted this, but can you speak a little bit to that dynamic of the Democrats, the kind of progressive Democrats in this state pushing back against what they're seeing federally and from the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, they said from the outset that one of their biggest priorities, aside from sort of this income tax, was positioning themselves against the federal government in case anything comes
Their way,
comes this way. And so they had the bill for the masks. They have the bill to warn workers if feds are going to come and investigate. So, they had several things, and it seemed like that was kind of one of their biggest priorities this session.
I mean, the left coast is trying to wall itself off. And, these are issues, the vaccine bill, where they now have the West Coast Alliance, and they pass a law saying we don't have to follow the FDA.
Which was also a governor request bill.
Right. Which I presume if the administration changes in a future year, that law will be, they'll just not, it'll lapse, or they just will continue to go back to FDA for vaccine guidance for families. I mean, each one of these is pretty particular, not necessarily examples of things that are happening right now, but it's sort of just kind of playing for the moment. Some of it may be the election. They dealt with the detention centers. Now you have cities trying to pass moratoriums so that they can't build new detention centers. It does win points for some of their communities, their constituencies, and it's also very real in some areas. I mean, the mask may not be as much of an issue with some, but environmental policy, they can't defend against some of the changes that the Trump administration is bringing with the environmental policy. I mean, they're forcing California to reopen some oil pipeline developments that have been closed for years, just finding a way around some of the rules. So there's reason to be wary on some of the steps that the administration's taken, and there's reasons to get political victories.
Another sort of very timely topic that this legislature started to grapple with was artificial intelligence, its impacts on the energy grid with respect to data centers, and then also impacts to users and especially kids. Let's start with the data center fight. There was a bill from Representative Beth Dolio to place new regulations on data centers. That seemed to have imploded. The tech industry fought back, killed it. In the meantime, they also lost their tax breaks for data centers. But any insights into what happened? Because again, you would think in a state like this, where Democrats are very much in charge, where there is a kind of predilection to pass environmental bills, the sort of consumer angle of saying, we're going to make sure that if more data centers are coming, you're not going to end up, the ratepayer aren't going to end up paying the bill kind of thing, protect water resources. Well, what happened there? Does this just show you the might of the tech lobby?
It's kind of funny. I asked leadership the last night of session, kind of what happened to that bill, and they kind of, didn't have a really straightforward answer. And then I asked, did lobbying have anything to do with this? No. They said it didn't, but we have internal emails. Conrad Swanson and I both had gotten emails about some of this internal play that was going on. He had gotten some stuff about...
He's one of your colleagues, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Microsoft kind of, not... Obviously, they're not in big support of it. Neither was Amazon. We got a letter from saying that Amazon had actually been kicked out of the Republican caucus and was they didn't want to deal with them anymore because they felt like they had kind of gotten the short end of the stick with some amendments that were passed on the bill that were encouraged by some Amazon lobbyists. So it depends on who you ask as to the reason why that bill failed, but it really seems like a lot of it was the internal lobbying from Microsoft and Amazon specifically.
Does the fact that the tax breaks went away, or at least the tax break for the the new equipment, replacement equipment. I mean, I feel like every time that came up for renewal, it was sort of like a done deal. They're gonna, it's gonna get renewed. And I know that lawmakers with data centers in their communities say that it is important. But it was interesting to me to see that just sort of poof went away.
Well, it was there right up to the very end, right? There was even rumors about
Well,
special session,
it almost hung up the last hours of the session.
I mean, they had problems getting to 50 votes. I think some of the votes in the caucus, again, were probably some folks were holding out, and they had some other problems they needed to get done with. I mean, the idea of, giving these large companies, it's not a very large tax break in the big picture of the $80 billion budget. At $63 million is not a huge, even over 2 years, it's not a huge amount for the company. So in some ways, it's probably symbolic of what they want, but it also sends a message of whether you want the industry or you don't want the industry. And you have unions. There's a group of unions that want the industry. There's communities that want the industry. And then there's also there's tribal issues, because where they want to build is in areas that are sometimes on or near sacred land. So you have very interesting competing forces, but the tax break was just a straight, do we give the big business what they want or don't give it what they want? They got to 52 votes, I think it was, and that probably represents, where they're going to get at this point on this kind of discussion in that caucus.
And then they did pass the AI chatbots bill, which was something the governor wanted. Puts Washington kind of in the vanguard of states regulating chatbots to protect kids in particular. There's disclosure to all users, but particular enhanced protections for minors. And it strikes me that this is not a state, and maybe it goes back to the tech lobby, that does a lot of tech regulation. But this one certainly punched through. Did either of you?
And without not as much fight as the data centers,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there wasn't many headlines on this stuff, and so maybe they have more understanding, or maybe there's just a better relationship between the regulatory, administration and these industries. They know how to talk to each other.
There was a broader algorithmic addictive feeds, quote unquote, addictive feeds bill that Attorney General Nick Brown wanted. Second year in a row, didn't pass, but the AI chatbots did. The results, I think it's like the early results of the work of the AI task force, kind of putting forward some ideas. It'll be interesting to kind of see in out years what else they do on this front, how much they want to regulate this kind of burgeoning
I suspect
industry.
there's some rulemaking that's going to go on, and they're going to hammer out some details in there and getting it. And then again, trying to enforce some of these new types of, these new regulations aren't going to be easy.
I probably should have mentioned this in the context also of the immigration mass and legislation around that, but the flock camera limits. These are the license plate reading cameras and I guess facial recognition cameras that have been implicated in some cases with immigration enforcement, where federal authorities were requesting information from local authorities based on what the cameras were collecting. That also seemed like a clear response to news headlines, concerns about data privacy and immigration enforcement.
And you add the voter data. And then we also passed a law, basically saying, no, we're not going to give the voter data to the federal government beyond what they can already get.
Yeah.
And so there was a handful of bills and a lot of bills. I mean, the cameras are in use. They are taking pictures right now at different places in the state. Your toll cameras and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So it is not a brand new technology. It's just no one anticipated that someone would want this information for something other than sending you a bill that you forgot to pay.
Well, and those are already coming under fire in some cities. We've seen, I think it's here in Olympia even, where the city council is trying to regulate those a little bit. There was that big request for records that went out that kind of started this whole thing, where the cities were saying, we don't have to give you records back. We don't, those aren't subject to the Public Records Act. And so that's led to this fight in certain cities where they just said, we're just going to shut them all off for right now until we figure something better out. So that's also kind of doing this interplay with what the legislature has also done this year.
Another bill that I thought was very interesting, in part because it's been the subject of a fight for at least a couple of years now, is over Rivian and Lucid and other electric car makers being able to sell direct to consumers, and the fight between the auto dealers and these electric vehicle makers. There was a bill last year that did not pass. The auto dealers were able to kill it. But this year, under threat of a very expensive ballot measure, something got through to at least allow those two automakers to sell direct, as Tesla does. What was you've written on this, Jerry, what was the breakthrough? Was it the threat of the ballot measure, and what allowed the
I
breakthrough?
dare say that was turned to auto dealers' heads on the idea of if we want to keep we wanted to keep them out, we're going to have to match them dollar for dollar. There's not 20
And they would be
million.
writing the initiative at that point.
Yeah, they were
Right.
already.
They would get to dictate how this was done.
Right.
You do it legislatively, you can negotiate the details.
And I suspect they would have used the legislation even as a starting point for their template.
So what was the compromise in the end?
I think the compromise is provisions that really limit. I mean, it gets so down to the point of you had to have at least 300 cars sold and in the state by January 1st, 2026. You have to be an American company. So just those two alone limited to these two companies, right?
And not for
Tesla.
legacy car makers who then have an electric vehicle line.
Right. They don't get to set up a separate subsidiary and start trying to do their own and sell directly. So that's in there barring it. There are other EV automakers that want to sell, but if they haven't sold 300 cars as of January 1st of this year, they're out. There is a worry. There's a Alliance for Automotive Innovation that represents the largest automakers in the country. They don't like it, and they say, hey, you got 3 businesses. That's a class. And so someone might be able to now sue the state, is what they would argue, if it becomes law, and claim, you can't have 3. If you allowed 1, okay, that's one deal when it was just Tesla. Now you have 3, you've opened the door to everybody.
For everybody. Interesting.
And then there's companies like Chinese firms that are government supported. They would be out now because it has U.S. language in it. But that's the real big fear, is that this would they could flood the market. And so I don't think we're done fighting. If this even becomes signed into law, which will happen in the next couple of weeks most likely, there'll be more firms coming in, there'll be more challenges. I think the legislature will be forever expanding that and they'll have to find something else to do.
Shauna, there's this very contested bill over additional higher standards for elected sheriffs. They have to have served in law enforcement for a certain amount of time. They've got to be certified. A lot of sheriffs came out of the woodwork and said this is the legislature and the state infringing on the fact that we're independent elected officials. There's now requests for partial vetoes of that bill of Governor Ferguson. But can you speak at all to this kind of, I don't know, sideshow fight, but it seemed like a big deal. I mean, I kept seeing the sheriffs showing up here and crying foul.
Yeah, and Sheriff Keith Swank from Pierce County. Yeah, he's obviously been kind of the biggest opponent to this thing. Some might argue that this is a get rid of Sheriff Swank bill, which is what it's kind of been dubbed, is that it's just a way to get him out of office, particularly because he is so outspoken. I was a little surprised to see Sheriff Sanders, Derek Sanders from Thurston County, who was also against this bill, considering there's a lot of drama between him
the two of them,
and Swank.
They agree that they don't like this bill.
Yeah, that's one thing they can agree on. And so, I mean, I could see this one maybe getting challenged, further down the road, but...
Well, I guess do you have a sense, either of you, of what motive, besides the Sheriff Swank piece, like, why, there's been a history of trying to do law enforcement accountability legislation in Olympia. It was obviously very intense a few years ago. It seems to sort of have eased up a little bit. But any sense of why this bill this year? What the reason? Again, it's a 60-day session.
I think
it's an election year.
You're looking at a bill that affects 39 people, right? A sheriff in each county. Most are elected. I think this goes into that same reaction to what's happened in the political climate in the Trump administration, because there are some sheriffs who, they don't necessarily want the sanctuary state policies. They don't want to enforce it. They're willing to pick up the phone if, or answer, if ICE calls, they're willing to answer and provide information and the state doesn't want them to. And so they want to try to find some ways to rein in and make sure all 39 sheriffs are following the state laws. I mean, it's a question for local folks. Is this who they want to elect or not? There's a sense that, there's an autonomy here for these sheriffs. I think in the end, though, I think voters would want to make sure the person who's their sheriff is followed all the same rules and training and certified the same way the officers are. I mean, you're theoretically putting a gun in their holster, letting them walk out. If they don't have all the same training and follow all the same guidelines and as their officers, and if their officers could be decertified and they couldn't, that probably doesn't seem fair to voters if they understood that. I think maybe this law will help educate some folks.
I want to ask you about some, kind of bring us back to what the Republicans are saying. They chalked up some wins, some things that they were, that died, that didn't happen. They talked about the initiative, the quote-unquote initiative killer bills. Maybe one of you can refresh us on what these would have done and why do you think they went by the wayside? It was basically changing the threshold or the process.
It added this, right at the front door, they added an extra door to get to the front door by saying.
To get an initiative on the ballot.
Yeah, because they're going to bring in, and it used to be a $5 fee. It's up to now $150, I think, to file. But when you file the paperwork, you also had to provide 1,000 signatures of people who liked your idea, which before it even goes to the Attorney General to get a title and all that detail, they needed 1,000. So that was the first one, and then they needed signatures.
Do you think these were like trial balloons and they just didn't fare well? They got shot down?
I mean, it's more reaction to the idea that it's become possible to get initiatives on the ballot, even though they need hundreds of thousands of signatures. Let's Go Washington has proven there is a way, there is a method that we can do it. And I think, again, the majority party, rather than just move on to other issues, has made this an issue.
Yeah, and I will say, I do feel like it is something that was kind of directly in response to Let's Go Washington. They've got the two initiatives that are coming up on the ballot this year.
Which I wanted to ask you about. There's a Parents' Bill of Rights and a prohibition on biological boys and girls sports. Two initiatives to the legislature that Democrats didn't even hear during the session will now go out to voters. But maybe a response to the success that Let's Go Washington has been having, at least getting stuff on the ballot.
Right. Well, and they did get the one, what was it last year?
Well, they had the initiative 2066 got on. They got which they helped gather the signatures, and then they qualified 6, and what was it in 2023? 6 initiatives. They ended up having to buy in 2024. They approved 3 of them, although they just basically tossed one out the window with the no income tax, with the income tax. But
so Republicans were unhappy that those 2 initiatives did not get hearings. They held their own kind of hearings, I guess unsanctioned or sort of outside the formal legislative process hearings. They're also quite upset about the state of the child welfare system and DCYF, the fentanyl crisis and the rising number of child fatalities and near fatalities from exposure to fentanyl. What they believe is poor case management at the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. I'm just interested why that has become so contentious and partisan. I would think that if kids are dying, everybody would care, and that they would demand a response. Is there something going on kind of behind the scenes here? I do understand that there's been a real effort to keep kids in their homes, to not pull them out when possible, and there seems to be some tension around what that breaking point should be. But it's interesting to me that this keeps coming up, and it doesn't seem like there's any resolution.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it comes from, this has been talked about for how long now, but, these kind of daycare centers with, folks showing up to daycare centers and saying that they're getting state money. And so there's a big push from that. That was such a big, other part of this conversation too from DCYF is, why are you allowing all these unpermitted daycares, or why is the state giving money to these daycares? And, so there's kind of been that battle going on aside from this other, protecting children from fentanyl idea, I guess.
And there's, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families for the last, they're dealing with a couple of laws that were passed a few years ago, and I think Republicans are trying to undo them. One is just allowing older, they're not even juveniles, right? They're 18 and older, staying in the juvenile rehabilitation facilities.
And not going to prison. Yeah.
Right. And then you have the Keep Families Together, the law that passed. They felt like it doesn't allow, we want parents, but sometimes parents aren't the right place and the right people to be taking care of their kids at that moment when they're in crisis. And they don't think the law needs amending. It needs changing, they say, to make sure that the government can go in and be more proactive on taking care of their children. And that's just the philosophical, I think, at this point. The language about imminent harm and not imminent harm, what that means, and how quickly the state can intervene in these situations that's a deeply personal issue that is going to divide the 147 lawmakers. Where is the line where you step in and say, that mom, that dad, that grandparent shouldn't be the one taking care of that child?
Something that I have not seen before is private money flowing into the state to fund a certain line item, if you will. The bombers are putting up potentially, I understand, $1 billion over the next decade to send 10,000 more kids into early learning programs. Normally, the state, that would be a function of the state, but this is private money that now the legislature had to pass a law to allow the state to spend in this fashion. I know some Democrats voted against it, I think maybe on principle, that they didn't like the way that this was being fashioned. But again, not something I've seen before. Any thoughts? It's a little bit like how the news business is being supported these days, right? Like private foundations come in and shore up the place. What's going on here?
Are you asking for Mr. or Mrs. Ballmer to maybe put $1 billion somewhere in particular? I can think of a place.
I am not lobbying for anything, no.
No. But
I'm just fascinated, though, that we've got private
And there's a whole
foundation
bank
money
account
going into
now.
the state. Yeah, a separate bank account.
They just signed the law to create that account.
Right.
I mean, they've had it, right, the colleges, everybody sort of, we want gifts to our universities and to our different programs, but this is directly into state government. I think it's the size. I think, having supporters of these programs is a great thing, but it's such a large amount and it's over a sustained period. But it also comes with some strings. The state cannot make any reductions in certain areas, and it can't go into the general fund. And unlike a tax, this is money has to go to a single purpose. So the state really has to behave over this next decade, and if they want to cash in and really get it, whether they get all that money, I mean, they have to still find providers. You still have to create programs, and if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to cash in on that money.
We have a couple minutes left. What, in kind of aggregate here, Democrats have such large majorities, I think it's worth maybe just ending on the note that they're not a monolith, right? We've seen a younger generation of lawmakers come in. The Democratic caucuses have gotten more progressive. We've seen Republican numbers diminish, but even the moderate suburban Democrats seem to have sort of, gone away. So when you think about, again, winners and losers and sort of what led this legislative session, what guided it, what carried the day, and you think about the makeup of the legislature, what's a takeaway or two?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It certainly seems like some of these more moderates, even on the income tax, Larry Springer, who kind of seemed at the beginning like he was against this idea of
Longtime
an income
Kirkland
tax.
Democrat. Yep.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Business
He
owner.
signed on ultimately, on the end and sided with the progressives, whereas you have your Amy Wallens from Kirkland as well, who are, have positioned themselves as these sort of moderates, and they won't, give any to the progressive party. So whether, she'll
But you
get-
certainly saw those tensions.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially as the bill was kind of like moving through the legislature, it saw those a lot more, but was surprised at the end to see some of those sort of peeling off to join forces with progressives.
I'll give you the last word, Jerry, just sort of the changing makeup of the
I don't
political makeup of the legislature.
I mean, it's so large, the majorities. I don't know if hubris is too strong a word, but it didn't feel in a short session that they felt unrestrained. Yes, they made cuts in the budget.
They didn't feel restrained, or they
Yeah,
felt
they felt
yeah.
restrained. They didn't
Yeah.
feel any restraint on where they wanted to do, looking at the policies they pursued. How long and what impact that has over the short term, if they've laid the groundwork for trouble for themselves, we'll find out.
Okay. Stop you both there. Jerry Cornfield from the Washington State Standard, Shauna Sowersby from the Seattle Times. Thank you both for coming in, debriefing with us. Get some rest now. The session is over. And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.